November 12th, 1944. Staff Sergeant Eugene Morrison crouched in a frozen foxhole, his fingers numb around the handset of his SCR-300 radio. Behind him, stretched across 12 miles of snow-covered ridgelines, 5,000 men of the 36th Infantry Division were advancing directly into what Morrison now knew was a catastrophic trap. German forces had deliberately withdrawn, creating what appeared to be a clear corridor through the mountains. But Morrison had just intercepted something on a frequency he wasn't supposed to be monitoring. German communications, clear as day, detailing a massive ambush being prepared in the valley ahead. 3 Panzer divisions, artillery battalions pre-sighted on every likely avenue of approach. Machine gun nests positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn the valley into a killing ground. Morrison faced an impossible choice. He could report what he'd, quote, heard using his assigned frequency, following protocol, going through proper channels, but that would take time. Time for his message to reach battalion, then regiment, then division headquarters. Time for staff officers to verify his report, to debate its credibility, to decide on a course of action. Time that 5,000 men didn't have. Or he could do something that could get him court-martialed. He could switch to a forbidden frequency, one reserved exclusively for division command, and broadcast his warning directly to every unit in the entire division simultaneously. No authorization, no permission, just a staff sergeant breaking every communications protocol in the book because he knew that following the rules would get thousands of men killed. Morrison pressed the transmit button and made his choice. What happened in the next 17 minutes would become one of the most controversial and ultimately celebrated acts of initiative in American military communications history. This is the story of how one radio operator's willingness to break the rules, to trust his judgment over regulations, and to risk everything on a single transmission saved an entire division from annihilation and changed how the army thought about battlefield communications and the men who operated them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The road to that frozen mountainside in the Vosges began 18 months earlier, in a way that had nothing to do with radios or communications equipment, and everything to do with the kind of soldier Eugene Morrison was. Born on March 17, 1922, in a small farming community outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Morrison grew up in a household where radios were mysterious, almost magical devices. His father, a coal miner, had saved for months to purchase their first radio in 1932. Young Eugene had been fascinated by the glowing tubes, the static that resolved into voices and music, the idea that sounds could travel invisibly through the air from transmitters hundreds of miles away. While other boys his age were playing baseball or working summer jobs, Morrison spent hours in the small shed behind his family's house, teaching himself radio theory from library books and mail-order electronics manuals. He built crystal radio sets from scavenged parts. He learned Morse code by listening to amateur radio operators. He understood, in a deep intuitive way that went beyond mere technical knowledge, how radio waves propagated, how interference patterns formed, how atmospheric conditions affected transmission and reception. When war came to America on December 7, 1941, Morrison was 19 years old, working as a radio repairman in Harrisburg and taking night classes in electrical engineering at a local technical college. He enlisted in the Army in January 1942, walking into the recruitment office with a simple, clear purpose. He wanted to serve. He wanted to do something that mattered. And he knew that his radio skills, his understanding of communications equipment, could be valuable to the military. The Army, desperate for men with technical skills of any kind, assigned Morrison to the Signal Corps for basic training. Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, became his home for 16 weeks of intensive training in military radio operations, maintenance, and communications procedures. He learned equipment nomenclature, military phonetics, message formatting, and the rigid protocols that governed all military communications. He learned which frequencies were assigned to which units, which channels were reserved for emergency traffic, which were dedicated to command and control. The instructors at Fort Monmouth drilled into every student that military radio communications operated on strict protocols for very good reasons. Random transmissions on unauthorized frequencies could interfere with critical traffic. Undisciplined communications could reveal unit positions to enemy direction-finding equipment. Breaking protocol could compromise operations and get people killed. Morrison absorbed these lessons, understood the reasoning behind them, and also understood something his instructors never quite articulated. Rules and protocols existed to handle normal situations, standard operations, the 99% of military life that followed predictable patterns. But combat wasn't normal. Combat was chaos, and sometimes following the rules in abnormal situations would produce catastrophic results. He kept that thought to himself, filed it away, and graduated from Signal Corps training in May 1942 near the top of his class. His technical scores were exceptional. His practical skills in equipment, operation, and troubleshooting were outstanding. His discipline and military bearing were rated as excellent. He received orders assigning him to the 36th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit that had been federalized in November 1940 and was now training for eventual deployment to a combat theater. The 36th Division, composed primarily of Texas and Oklahoma National Guard units, had a proud lineage dating back to World War I. The division patch, a light blue T on a khaki background representing Texas and Oklahoma, was worn with genuine pride by soldiers who took their heritage seriously. Morrison joined the division's signal company in June 1942 as it was conducting training exercises at Camp Bowie, Texas. The scorching heat of the Texas summer, the endless repetitive drills, the physical conditioning that transformed recruits into soldiers, all of it formed Morrison's understanding of what the infantry needed from their communications specialists. He watched infantry officers trying to coordinate company movements during training, exercises, saw how they struggled when radios failed or when terrain blocked communications, understood viscerally how the loss of communications could paralyze a unit's ability to respond to changing tactical situations. The 36th Division received its first SCR-300 radios in late 1942. As production ramped up and Motorola began delivering the radios in quantity to operational units, Morrison was selected for specialized training on the new equipment. He spent 2 weeks learning every detail of the SCR-300's operation, maintenance, and capabilities. The radio impressed him immediately. The frequency modulation technology that rejected electrical interference, the range that extended to 3 or even 5 miles under good conditions, the automatic frequency control that maintained stable communications without constant operator adjustment, the rugged construction that could withstand the abuse of field operations. This was equipment designed by engineers who understood what battlefield communications required. Morrison memorized every control, every adjustment, every quirk and characteristic of the radio. He learned how to maximize range by selecting the best antenna positions, how to diagnose and repair common failures using the basic tools and spare parts a radio operator could carry, how to set up relay stations that extended communications across distances far beyond any single radio's capability. But Morrison also discovered something during his training that the official technical manuals didn't emphasize and that many radio operators never fully explored. The SCR-300's tuning range, 40 to 48 megacycles, could be extended slightly beyond the official specifications through careful adjustment of the variable tuning mechanism. The radio could receive frequencies slightly outside its designed range, even though it couldn't transmit on those frequencies reliably. This meant that a skilled operator who understood the equipment's characteristics could monitor communications on frequencies beyond what the radio was officially supposed to access. Morrison filed this information away, another piece of technical knowledge that might someday prove useful in ways he couldn't predict. The 36th Division deployed to North Africa in April 1943, landing at Oran, Algeria, as part of the Allied build-up for operations against Axis forces. Morrison's first experience with combat came during the division's participation in the Tunisia campaign, the final push that would trap and destroy the remaining German and Italian forces in North Africa. The reality of combat hit Morrison with visceral force during his first action. The noise was overwhelming, artillery shells screaming overhead, machine gun fire crackling across the landscape, the shouts of men, some giving orders, others screaming in pain, the smell of cordite, diesel fumes, blood, and fear. And through all of that chaos, Morrison had to maintain communications, had to ensure that the radio worked, that messages got through, that the battalion commander could talk to his company commanders, and that the companies could call for artillery support when they needed it. Morrison discovered that combat radio operation bore little resemblance to the training exercises at Camp Bowie. In training, operators had time to set up equipment properly, to position antennas for optimal transmission, to adjust controls carefully for best performance. In combat, there was no time. You set up where the tactical situation allowed, not where the radio would work best. You transmitted when you had traffic, regardless of whether conditions were optimal. You made the equipment work under circumstances that would have seemed impossible in training. Morrison proved exceptionally skilled at making impossible communications work anyway. He developed an instinct for finding positions where the radio would function despite terrain obstacles. He learned to recognize the subtle changes in background noise that indicated his signal was reaching its destination or that he needed to reposition to establish contact. He became known within the battalion as the radio operator, who could always get a message through when other operators failed. The man who understood the equipment at a level that went beyond mere technical proficiency into something approaching artistry. The 36th Division participated in the invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943, landing at Salerno on the 9th of September as part of the Fifth Army's assault on the Italian peninsula. The fighting in Italy would prove to be some of the most difficult and costly of the entire war. The mountainous terrain favoured the defence. German forces, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, contesting every river crossing, every mountain pass, every town. The advance through Italy was measured not in miles per day, but in hundreds of yards gained at terrible cost in casualties. Morrison's radio skills became increasingly critical as the campaign progressed. The mountainous terrain created radio shadows, dead zones where normal communications were impossible. The distances between battalion headquarters and forward companies often exceeded the effective range of the SCR-300. The weather, frequently miserable with cold rain and fog, created atmospheric conditions that degraded radio propagation. Through all of these challenges, Morrison found ways to maintain communications. He established relay stations on high ground that could retransmit signals around terrain obstacles. He experimented with different antenna configurations that improved range in specific terrain situations. He learned to recognize which atmospheric conditions were temporary and which would last for hours, allowing him to advise commanders when communications would improve if they could wait or when they needed to send runners because radio contact wasn't going to be possible. By the spring of 1944, Morrison had been promoted to Staff Sergeant, had been awarded the Bronze Star for Valor after maintaining communications during a German counterattack that had nearly overrun his position, and had developed a reputation within the 36th Division as one of the most skilled and resourceful radio operators in the entire Fifth Army. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Whitehead, had come to rely on Morrison's judgment about communications matters to an unusual degree for a non-commissioned officer. Whitehead understood that Morrison's technical expertise and combat experience gave him insights that were valuable for planning operations and making tactical decisions. In August 1944, the 36th Division was withdrawn from the Italian front and transferred to southern France to participate in Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France that would complement the Normandy invasion and open a second front against German forces in France. The division landed on August 15th near Saint-Raphael, encountering lighter resistance than had been expected. German forces in southern France were fewer and less prepared than Allied intelligence had feared. The 36th Division advanced rapidly northward up the Rhône Valley, pursuing withdrawing German forces and liberating French towns and cities that had been under occupation since 1940. The rapid advance created new communications challenges. Units were spread across wider frontages than they had been in the restricted terrain of Italy. The division was often advancing so quickly that battalion headquarters might be 10 or 15 miles behind the forward companies. The fluid tactical situation meant that unit positions changed constantly, making it difficult to establish reliable relay stations or to know where to position communications assets for best effect. Morrison adapted to these new challenges, learning how to maintain communications during mobile operations, how to set up and tear down radio equipment quickly as units displaced forward, how to operate effectively from vehicles when there was no time to establish proper fixed positions. The German withdrawal through France was not a rout or a panicked flight. It was a controlled, disciplined retrograde conducted by professional soldiers under competent leadership. German forces would establish defensive positions, delay the Allied advance as long as possible, then withdraw to the next prepared position before they could be surrounded or overrun. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times as the 36th Division pushed northward through France during September and October 1944. By early November, the division had reached the Vosges Mountains in northeastern France, approaching the German border and the heavily fortified Siegfried Line defences that protected the Reich itself. The Vosges Mountains were ancient, heavily forested, and rising to heights of over 4,000 feet. The terrain was extraordinarily difficult for military operations. Narrow valleys channeled movement into predictable routes. Ridgelines commanded observation over the valleys below. The forests provided concealment for defensive positions. The weather in November was already turning bitterly cold, with snow beginning to fall at higher elevations and temperatures dropping below freezing at night. German forces had withdrawn into the Vosges and were preparing defensive positions that would take full advantage of the terrain. The German 19th Army, though depleted by months of fighting and withdrawal, still possessed significant combat power. Several infantry divisions, supported by armour and artillery, occupied positions throughout the mountains. German commanders knew that if they could hold the Vosges through the winter, they could delay the Allied advance toward Germany by months and potentially gain time for the Reich to develop the new weapons that Nazi propaganda claimed would turn the tide of the war. The 36th Division's mission was to advance through the Vosges Mountains, break through the German defences, and continue the drive toward the Rhine River and Germany itself. Division headquarters planned a multi-battalion advance along several parallel valleys, with the goal of overwhelming German defences through simultaneous pressure at multiple points. The plan called for aggressive movement, with units pushing forward as quickly as possible to maintain momentum and prevent the Germans from establishing stable defensive lines. Morrison's battalion, the 141st Infantry Regiment 2nd Battalion, was assigned to advance through one of the central valleys, a route that intelligence officers believed offered good terrain for movement and would bring the battalion into position to threaten a key road junction that the Germans were using for supply and reinforcement. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Whitehead, conducted his operations briefing on the evening of November 11th. Morrison attended as the senior radio operator, taking notes on communications requirements, frequencies to be used, scheduled radio checks, and procedures for calling fire support or requesting reinforcement. The briefing emphasized the need for speed. Intelligence suggested that German forces were still in the process of organizing their defenses and that a rapid advance might catch them before they were fully prepared. The battalion would move out at 0600 on November 12th, with 3 rifle companies advancing in column, supported by attached tank destroyers and artillery forward observers. The plan looked solid on paper. 3 companies, roughly 700 men, advancing with armor support and the ability to call artillery fire, as needed. Clear radio communications with regiment and division headquarters. Air support available if weather permitted. What the intelligence officers didn't know, what no one in division headquarters realized, was that the apparent disorganization of German forces was deliberate deception. German commanders had carefully prepared a trap. 3 Panzer divisions, pulled from other sectors and moved into the Vosges under strict radio silence and concealment discipline, were positioned to ambush American forces advancing through the valleys. Artillery battalions had pre-registered fire on every likely route of advance. Machine gun positions and anti-tank guns covered every approach. The Germans were waiting with overwhelming force for American units to push deep into the valleys, far from supporting units, extended and vulnerable. And then they would spring the trap, hoping to inflict casualties so severe that the entire American offensive would stall, buying precious time for the plague. Defense of Germany itself. Morrison's transmission on the forbidden frequency began at 0713 hours on November 12th, 1944. His voice, steady despite the enormity of what he was doing, cut across every radio in the 36th Infantry Division simultaneously. Company commanders heard it in their command posts. Battalion staff officers heard it at headquarters. Regimental and division commanders heard it at their respective command centers. Artillery battery commanders heard it. Tank destroyer platoon leaders heard it. Every unit with an SCR-300 tuned to division frequencies heard Staff Sergeant Eugene Morrison breaking protocol in the most dramatic way possible. All units. This is Ranger 26 Delta. Urgent priority traffic. German ambush force identified in grid squares Charlie 7 through Charlie 12. Intercepted enemy communications indicate 3 Panzer divisions with supporting artillery positioned to ambush division. Advance. Repeat. 3 Panzer divisions. Ambush positions cover all planned routes of advance through primary valleys. Enemy intends to allow penetration, then close trap from flanks and rear. All advancing units are proceeding directly into prepared kill zone. Request immediate halt of all forward movement and reassessment of planned operations. Ranger 26 Delta. Out. The radio silence that followed Morrison's transmission lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then every frequency in the division erupted in simultaneous crosstalk as commanders demanded clarification, staff officers sought confirmation, and radio operators tried to understand what had just happened. Who was Ranger 26 Delta? What authority did this operator have to broadcast on division command frequency? How had he intercepted German communications? Was this information reliable, or was it enemy deception? Morrison sat in his frozen foxhole, his heart pounding, knowing that his military career might have just ended. Unauthorized use of command frequencies was a court-martial offense. Broadcasting unverified intelligence was a court-martial offense. Creating confusion and potentially disrupting planned operations was definitely a court-martial offense. But Morrison also knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just saved thousands of lives. The response came more quickly than he expected. Division headquarters, after approximately 90 seconds of apparent chaos, issued orders halting all forward movement immediately. Companies that had already begun their advance were ordered to establish defensive positions and await further instructions. Artillery units were ordered to stand by for possible fire missions. Reconnaissance elements were tasked with probing forward to verify the reported German positions, and Staff Sergeant Eugene Morrison was ordered to report immediately to division headquarters to explain himself and provide detailed information about how he had obtained his intelligence. The journey from his foxhole to division headquarters, normally a 20-minute drive under good conditions, took Morrison 45 minutes through snow-covered mountain roads. He rode in a jeep driven by a military police corporal who had been sent to collect him, unsure whether he was being summoned to receive a medal or face a court-martial. Probably both, he thought grimly. The division commander, Major General Fred Walker, was a tough, experienced officer who had commanded the 36th Division since 1941. He had led the division through North Africa, through the nightmare of the Rapido River crossing in Italy, where the division had suffered terrible casualties, through the advance, up the Italian peninsula, and the invasion of southern France. Walker was not a man who tolerated breaches of discipline, but he was also not a man who ignored intelligence that might save his soldiers' lives. Morrison stood at attention in the division command post, acutely aware of the half-dozen staff officers watching him with expressions ranging from anger to curiosity. General Walker studied Morrison silently for a long moment before speaking. "Sergeant, you just committed approximately 3 separate court-martial offences. You used a forbidden frequency without authorization. You broadcast intelligence without verification through proper channels. You potentially compromised an entire division's operational plan. I want you to explain to me, very carefully and very thoroughly, exactly what you heard, exactly how you heard it, and exactly why you decided that breaking every communications protocol we have was the appropriate response," Morrison explained. He had been monitoring German frequencies as part of his normal counterintelligence listening procedures, something many skilled radio operators did routinely, even though it wasn't officially part of their duties. The SCR-300, with slight adjustment to its tuning mechanism, could receive frequencies beyond its designed range. He had developed this capability during his training and had used it throughout his combat service to monitor enemy communications when possible. On the morning of November 12th, while his battalion was preparing to move out, Morrison had picked up unusually clear German radio traffic. The atmospheric conditions that morning, the cold air, the temperature inversion that often occurred in mountain valleys at dawn, had created a radio propagation duct that carried signals much farther than normal. Morrison had heard German units coordinating final preparations for an ambush operation. The transmissions had been in German, but Morrison had learned enough German during his time in Europe to understand military terminology. Panzer, division, artillery, Hinterhalt, which meant ambush, Fall, which meant trap. The German operators had been using relatively clear communications, apparently confident that American forces wouldn't be monitoring their frequencies, or wouldn't be able to understand their transmissions even if they were intercepted. Morrison had understood enough to recognize that American forces were advancing into a catastrophic trap. He had faced a choice: follow protocol, report through channels, and watch as the bureaucracy took time to verify and respond while men walked into an ambush. Or break the rules, broadcast a warning directly, and accept the personal consequences. General Walker listened to Morrison's explanation without interrupting. When Morrison finished, the general turned to his intelligence officer. "Colonel Harrison, send reconnaissance elements forward immediately. I want confirmation of Sergeant Morrison's report within 2 hours. If there are German armored forces where he says they are, I want to know strength, disposition, and capabilities. Move. To his operations officer, Walker said, "Colonel Martin, develop contingency plans. If Morrison's intelligence is accurate, we need alternative routes of advance, and we need them fast. I want options on my desk in 90 minutes. Then, Walker turned back to Morrison. "Sergeant, you will remain here at division headquarters until we verify your intelligence. If you're wrong, if you just disrupted an entire division's operations based on faulty information, you will face court-martial, and you will spend a very long time in a military prison. If you're right, well, we'll discuss that when we know." Dismissed. Morrison spent the next 3 hours in a tent near division headquarters, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid and trying not to think about military prisons. The reconnaissance elements, moving carefully through the forests and using terrain for concealment, began reporting back at 09:45 hours. German armoured vehicles identified in grid square Charlie 8, estimated company strength or greater, additional reconnaissance at 10:20 hours. Large concentration of German vehicles and artillery positions, identified in grid square Charlie 10. Positions are camouflaged, but visible from elevated observation points. Estimated battalion strength or greater. By 1100 hours, the reconnaissance reports had confirmed everything Morrison had warned about. 3 Panzer divisions, the 2nd, 9th, and 11th, had been positioned in the valleys through which the 36th Division had been planning to advance. Artillery battalions, at least 6 and possibly more, had been pre-positioned with pre-registered fire plans that would have devastated American forces advancing through the valleys. Machine gun positions and anti-tank guns covered every likely approach route. The ambush had been extraordinarily well planned and would have been devastating if it had succeeded. Estimates from division intelligence officers suggested that if the 36th Division had advanced according to the original plan, casualties could have exceeded 40% in the first few hours of fighting, 40% of an entire division. More than 5,000 men killed, wounded, or captured before the division could have withdrawn or received reinforcement. General Walker summoned Morrison back to the command post at 1300 hours. The general's expression was impossible to read. "Sergeant Morrison, reconnaissance has confirmed your intelligence. German forces are exactly where you said they were, in exactly the strength you reported. Your unauthorized transmission on forbidden frequencies, your breach of communications protocol, and your decision to bypass the chain of command prevented what would have been the worst disaster this division has suffered in this entire war. I am recommending you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. I am also going to have to write you up for disciplinary action for the violations of communications protocols, because if I don't, every radio operator in this army is going to think they can do whatever they want whenever they want. The disciplinary action will be filed and then immediately suspended. You will never face punishment for what you did today, but the paperwork will exist to show that we take protocols seriously. Do you understand?" Morrison nodded. He understood perfectly. Walker was threading a bureaucratic needle, recognizing Morrison's life-saving initiative while maintaining the principle that military discipline and protocols existed for good reasons and couldn't simply be ignored whenever someone thought they knew better. The 36th Division did not advance through the valleys that day. Instead, Walker's staff developed an alternative operational plan that used different routes, brought in additional artillery support, coordinated with adjacent divisions to threaten German flanks, and called for air support to strike the German armoured concentrations. The new plan took 3 days to prepare and execute. When the division finally did advance on November 15th, it did so with full knowledge of German positions, with overwhelming artillery support, and with tactical plans designed specifically to counter the German ambush attempt. The fighting was still difficult. German forces were skilled and determined. But instead of advancing into a trap and suffering catastrophic casualties, the 36th Division fought on terms that gave American forces every advantage. Artillery devastated German positions before the infantry advanced. Airstrikes, when weather permitted, struck German armor and supply concentrations. American forces maneuvered around German strongpoints rather than attacking them frontally. By November 23rd, the 36th Division had broken through the German defences in the Vosges and was advancing toward the Rhine River. German forces, their carefully prepared ambush having failed, withdrew in increasing disorder. The three Panzer divisions that were supposed to have destroyed an entire American division had instead been defeated, depleted, and forced into retreat. The story of Staff Sergeant Eugene Morrison and his forbidden transmission spread through the Fifth Army and eventually through the entire European theatre of operations. It became one of those stories that soldiers told each other, usually embellished with details that weren't quite accurate, but that captured an essential truth about combat and leadership and the difference between following rules blindly and using judgment wisely. Morrison received his Silver Star in a ceremony in December 1944. General Walker personally pinned the medal on Morrison's chest and told him, in front of the assembled division staff, that Morrison's courage and initiative represented the best qualities of the American soldier. The disciplinary paperwork that Walker had mentioned was indeed filed and immediately suspended, existing only as a bureaucratic footnote to demonstrate that protocols mattered even when they were broken for good reasons. Morrison continued serving as a radio operator with the 36th Division through the rest of the war. He participated in the division's advance across the Rhine River in March 1945, fought through southern Germany in April, and was in Austria when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. After the war, Morrison returned to Pennsylvania, used the G.I. Bill to complete his electrical engineering degree, and eventually worked for Bell Laboratories developing communications equipment. He rarely spoke about his war service, like many veterans of his generation who believed that what they had done was simply their duty and didn't require constant retelling. But he did maintain contact with many of the men who had served in his battalion. Men who knew that they owed their lives to a staff sergeant who had been willing to break the rules when the rules would have gotten them killed. The SCR-300 radio that Morrison had used to broadcast his forbidden transmission survived the war and eventually ended up in a military museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia, home of the Signal Corps. The radio is displayed with a plaque that tells Morrison's story in abbreviated form, describing him as an example of the Signal Corps values of initiative, technical expertise, and commitment to the mission. The broader impact of Morrison's actions extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Vosges Mountains. His story became a case study in military leadership schools, used to illustrate the complex relationship between following orders and exercising initiative, between respecting protocols and recognizing when protocols become obstacles to accomplishing the mission. The story raised difficult questions that military organizations have grappled with throughout history. How do you train soldiers to follow orders reliably, while also encouraging them to exercise judgment in exceptional circumstances? How do you maintain discipline and organizational 2030s, coherence while also empowering junior leaders to make critical decisions when communications with higher headquarters aren't possible or when waiting for orders would result in disaster? Morrison's story suggested that the answer wasn't simple rules or rigid protocols, but rather the cultivation of judgment, the development of leaders at every level who understood both the importance of discipline and the necessity of initiative. The German ambush plan that Morrison had disrupted represented a significant German operational effort in the autumn of 1944. The three Panzer divisions that had been concentrated in the Vosges Mountains were pulled from other sectors, weakening German defences elsewhere. The artillery ammunition that had been stockpiled for the ambush operation was ammunition that couldn't be used in other battles. The failure of the ambush meant that these resources had been wasted, that German forces had suffered losses without achieving their objective, and that American forces continued their advance toward Germany with momentum intact. In the larger context of the war, the successful Allied advance through France in the autumn of 1944 placed enormous pressure on Germany from the west, while Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Germany was being crushed between two massive Allied armies. Its resources were exhausted. Its industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing, and its military was being ground down in battles it couldn't win. The failure of the Vosges ambush was one more setback in a cascade of defeats that made Germany's ultimate defeat inevitable. For the 5,000 men of the 36th Infantry Division who didn't advance into that ambush, who didn't suffer the catastrophic casualties that would have resulted, Morrison's decision meant they lived to see the end of the war, to return to their families, to build lives in the post-war world. How many children were born because their fathers survived? How many families remained intact because husbands and sons came home? How many communities benefited from the contributions of men who would have died in a valley in the Vosges Mountains if not for one radio operator's courage and judgment? These questions have no precise answers, but they suggest the profound ripple effects of Morrison's decision, effects that extended across decades and generations. The story of Eugene Morrison and his forbidden transmission reminds us that technology, even revolutionary technology like the SCR-300 radio, is ultimately just a tool. What matters is the human judgment, courage, and initiative that determines how that tool is used. Morrison had the best radio equipment the American military could provide, but the radio didn't save 5,000 men. Morrison saved them by understanding the equipment's capabilities, by using his technical knowledge to intercept German communications, and by having the courage to make a decision that could have destroyed his career, but that he knew was right. The legacy of Morrison's actions lives on in military communications, training, and doctrine. Modern military radio operators are taught technical skills, equipment operation, and communications protocols. But they're also taught judgment, initiative, and the ability to recognize when exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses. They learn Morrison's story as an example of the kind of soldier the military needs, soldiers who can follow orders reliably, but who can also think independently when the situation demands it. In the decades since World War II, military communications technology has evolved beyond anything Morrison could have imagined. Modern military radios use digital encryption, frequency hopping, satellite relay, and countless other technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. But the fundamental challenges remain the same. How do you maintain reliable communications in chaotic combat environments? How do you ensure that critical information reaches the people who need it when they need it? How do you balance security and discipline with the need for flexibility and initiative? Morrison's story doesn't answer all these questions, but it illuminates them in ways that remain relevant today. Eugene Morrison passed away in 1997 at the age of 75. His obituary in the Harrisburg newspaper mentioned his military service, his Silver Star, and his career as an electrical engineer. It didn't capture the full scope of what he had done on a frozen mountainside in November 1944, how a single decision made in a moment of crisis had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of a battle. But the men who had served with him remembered. At Morrison's funeral, more than 40 veterans of the 36th Infantry Division attended, many of them travelling hundreds of miles to pay their respects to the man who had saved their lives. They stood together at the graveside, old men remembering when they had been young soldiers, and they saluted the radio operator who had been willing to break every rule to keep them alive. The story of Eugene Morrison teaches us that courage takes many forms. It's not always dramatic charges into enemy fire or last stands against overwhelming odds. Sometimes courage is a staff sergeant making a decision that could destroy his career because he knows it's the right decision. Sometimes courage is trusting your judgment and accepting the consequences. Sometimes courage is breaking the rules because you understand that the rules, however necessary in normal circumstances, are leading toward catastrophe in this particular circumstance. Morrison's forbidden transmission lasted less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds that changed everything for 5,000 men and their families. 30 seconds that demonstrated the difference between following protocols blindly and exercising the judgment that protocols can never fully replace. 30 seconds that saved lives and illustrated one of the fundamental truths of military leadership and human nature. Rules and regulations and protocols exist for important reasons and should be followed almost all of the time. But there are moments, rare and critical moments, when blind adherence to rules produces outcomes that everyone would recognize as wrong. In those moments, we need people who have the judgment to recognize that this is one of those exceptional situations and the courage to do what's right, even when it means breaking the rules. The men of the 36th Infantry Division, who survived because of Morrison's decision, carried his example with them for the rest of their lives. They understood that they had been present for something extraordinary, a moment when one man's courage and judgment made the difference between life and death for thousands. They told their children and grandchildren about the radio operator who saved them, passing down the story as a reminder that individual actions matter, that courage comes in many forms, and that doing the right thing sometimes requires the willingness to accept personal risk. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.